Good morning, and good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you might be joining us. My name is Adam Lawson. I'm a product developer here at BMC with our Solution Engineering and Architect Leaders team. Over the past several weeks, we've been engaging with everyone here in these webinars on managing your CMDB in a modern IT environment. That's really been a key focal point. It's one of the things of the past several months here at BMC we've seen a lot of engagement with and a lot of questions about. And today we're going to talk about, as a conclusion of this series, how do you manage your data in your CMDB? It's probably the thing everyone questions the most. You're wondering, how do I do this? How do I do that? A whole bunch of questions that come out of how do I manage all this data that I've gathered from Discovery, from Atrium Integrator? How do I manage my normalized and not normalized data? And how do I do all of these different things that we've talked about over the past few weeks? But before we begin, I want to go ahead and go over a quick legal notice. This is a live and interactive recorded session. Anything you share, other customers will be able to see, they will be able to hear, so be very mindful of that. If you don't want to participate, that's perfectly reasonable. You can go ahead and close the call now. This will be available on communities and YouTube for you to watch at a later point in time, and we encourage you to do that. Today we're going to go ahead and start with these data management steps. These are very high-level steps: process, execution, and upkeep. All three of these are very simple, but they're required. Process would include things like having a standardized process for reporting, for how to report the issues in live environments, and then remediation steps. Execution would fall into the line of having a way to actually do the processes that you have established. For example, having a dedicated person to run the report so that way you can evaluate them, being faithful in that execution, and then upkeep, how to improve that over time so that way you don't continually have these problems. We're going to talk about a lot of things today, starting with duplicates. Today's session will be a little bit longer than the past couple of weeks have been. That's just because of the nature of the topic today, dealing with data issues. There are so many variables that come into play that we can't possibly cover them all in a full hour, much less the 30 minutes we're going to do this in. But we are going to key in on a few of the primary aspects of each of these. And our documentation has more information on each one of these processes, and we'll be more than glad to discuss with you after the initial presentation for any holes that maybe I vaguely glossed over but didn't dive deep enough for you. The first thing to keep in mind, though, is every organization is going to have slightly different processes, slightly different execution and upkeep because of the natural variabilities across these different organizations. A bank is not going to have the same requirements as a local school system, and they're not going to have the same requirements as a retail store. Everyone's going to require slightly different things. They're going to look at it slightly differently. They're going to have different retention policies. They're going to have different sources of data. They're going to have more complexity, less complexity, all kinds of things that will have to be taken into account. But we're going to go ahead and start with duplicates. And once again, we're going to keep with this three-step approach: process, execution, and upkeep. Those are the three primary steps. What is your process for duplicate handling? Well, you can build a report, an AR system report that's mailed to you once a week that you have found a qualification that works well for you. You could also build a dashboard using BMC dashboards, a really great tool. That way you can log in once a week and just check it on the fly. But there's also the CMDB dashboard, KPI metrics. I'll show you how to do that later in this video. That's probably going to be the primary source for most customers to identify this. But you also can't rule out, which is innately important, having the ability to report this live in the environment. Your asset management team needs to be able to report to your CMDB administrators with either an incident ticket, a work order, or some way so that can be identified and remediated quickly on the fly. But then your execution steps going to include identifying, confirming, and remediating duplicates. Identifying goes hand in hand with these dashboards and the reports, but that's not everything. You're going to have to confirm that the two computer systems they reported are actually duplicates and not just one computer system from 2 years ago that we have historical data on. And yes, it had the same IP address as another system now, but this new one's just a replacement. They're not actually duplicates. Then you're going to have to look at how to remediate those duplicates, and we'll talk about that as well. And then your upkeep, enhancing your data source, updating identification rules, and introducing fail-safes. Of course, enhancing your data source like Discovery or some external database that you're using with HM Integrator or anything like that. You might have to get a new TKU update in Discovery. And maybe your data source isn't complete and you're going to have to figure out a way to gather more data in that database. If you're not, then you have to update your identification rules so that way it can make use of your data sources. We'll talk about that a little bit too. And then introducing fail-safes. I'm not going to demonstrate that today, but that's something as simple as adding a filter that requires serial number. Those are 3 quick things for upkeep that you might want to take into consideration. We also have to consider retiring CIs. This, once again, has a process, execution, and upkeep. We have our reconciliation purge activities. We have archive policies, and we have decommission reports that we can go and double check the work. We talked about purge activities a little bit last week, but not really a lot. We're going to dive in that a little bit more now. And then configuring recon jobs. Once again, we talked about that last week. We're not going to dive into a whole lot, but we will gloss over that later on in this demonstration. And then configuring archiving. As a rule of thumb for CMDB data, archiving is something that we want you to use as plan B. Reason being is very simple. A CMDB is meant to be a snapshot of your environment as it is now. CMDBs are not inherently, whether it's BMC CMDB or some other CMDB from another organization, they are not meant to be historical records of archive. Now, we have this ability of archiving that you are more than welcome to use. It works perfectly fine, but there are certain implications that get into that. So if you're considering archiving in your CMDB, you might want to ask for some help. You might want to investigate that a little bit further. And then, of course, report on your mark as delete and copy before delete. We're going to talk about that as well later on. The last thing we're going to talk about today as far as managing your data is maximizing your data sets. And this requires a knowledge of data sources. You need to have a process before you just introduce a new data source. I think that gets more customers in trouble than anything else. Someone will say, I have a spreadsheet to import, and we just willy-nilly do it because we know how to. But then 6 months later, we realize that this data set that we just grabbed wasn't complete. We didn't validate a lot of it. We didn't force that import to go through the necessary processes to make sure we didn't allow junk into our system. But then we also need to make data entry predictable. We need to have some way, somehow, to know that Discovery is going to import something every day, and that client management is going to do it every 3 days, and that this database we're going to do once a month, and we have a spreadsheet import once a year. You need to make this predictable. You need to make it repeatable, so that way your organization will be able to keep up with the load accurately. If it's unpredictable, you can't predict your workload. That's how people end up taking shortcuts to meet deadlines, all because the planning wasn't done up front. Also, how you execute that, of course, data sets. One thing we're going to talk about is using data sets more generously. And then locking data sets. That's another thing we'll talk about here in a little bit. And maintenance, how to upkeep this. This kind of goes hand in hand with what I was saying about making this predictable. You need to be able to predict your work long term. You need to know that every February is audit season. So January, I'm going to be focusing on these imports. And I need at minimum 60 hours to make that work right. If I have anything less than that, we're not going to be able to get it done in time with the quality we expect. Maintaining that upkeep, while it is hard, sometimes there's just work that has to be done. There's no way around it. All right, so I am logged into the CMDB portal, and the first example we're going to go through is an example of a duplicate. This is just going to be a report from a user that, hey, I have found a duplicate in the system. Will you please investigate? We're going to quickly search here. This report would be on a printer, and they gave me the name. Okay, sure enough, I have two printers. So let's go ahead, grab both of those, show and explore, and you'll see that it has two different printers in here. Now, obviously, there's already a discrepancy that I found. I'm going to go ahead and show CI details, and we can switch back and forth here, and we can verify that the name is in fact the same. But we can also look at these and clearly see one of them has a description that tells us that it's a Canon printer. The other one gives us a description that it is a HP DeskJet printer. So when we look at this and we go to actual company, this is assigned to as Petramco. Let's look at this one. This one is also assigned to Petramco. You know, the short description says Canon, but what does the manufacturer say? So the manufacturer name is not listed. So that's interesting to see. I wonder about the other one. So this does have a manufacturer. Based upon the information provided thus far, I would still want to investigate. I would want to go physically check that this is or isn't the case. But based upon this information, it looks like someone has manually entered this Canon. You know, there's several things that are just unknown. We don't have a manufacturer. We don't have a model, I'm assuming. Version. None of the information is filled out. It looks like this particular printer someone manually entered, and they probably got it wrong. They probably just typed the wrong entry in and didn't have all of the information. Another way to quickly validate this is I can go ahead and switch over to edit mode, and it will switch the Explorer to edit mode. Notice how it puts me in a sandbox. I can right click this and click edit instance, and it will bring this up in mid-tier. I already know the information, so I'm going to go ahead and just pull this up. So there are 3 entries. One is my sandbox, where I've been playing around with that in the CMDB Explorer. So that's relatively new. You can see that matches the same date timestamp as what my system has just a few minutes ago. But then we have another one on 8.7, and the other one is also at the same time 8.7. They're both in the production data set. Neither of them have a source data set record. And we can also look at the attribute data source list right here and clearly see that neither one of them have a record. I know that this was manually imported at some point in time, and based upon this information, it's pretty clear that this record is probably inaccurate. I could go ahead, mark this record for deletion. Never, for any reason, delete a CMDB record from the system directly. Always mark the record for deletion. During the next purge job, this record will then be deleted, and any children relationships will also be evaluated and deleted as needed. Very important, otherwise you will leave orphan data laying around in your system, which very much so can become problematic later on. So I'm going to go back to my dashboard. And now I can see that there's only one record coming back because all of our applications will not show marked as deleted items, even if they haven't been deleted yet. All right, so let's look at a slightly more complex example. Also, a key point of this is building reports and being able to review that. Let's actually look at that first, because that's how I found this example. If you click on configurations and you go to dashboard parameters, dashboard, and data sources, you'll come to a configuration screen where you can enable or disable duplicates processing. Now, this is enabled on my box, so I'm going to leave it that way for now. But know that this does come disabled out of the box, so you will need to enable this. The KPI metrics dashboard process originally took about 5 minutes to run, give or take, maybe a little bit less without that enabled. Once I enabled it and ran the job again, it took about 20 to 25 minutes to complete. And this is on a system with sample data. It doesn't have a ton of data in it. It's also on a system with minimal resources. It's a single server and it's a shared database. So there's definitely some hardware limitations. But keep that in mind that enabling it will cause this to run quite a bit longer. Just be aware of that. But once you have that enabled, you can see on my dashboard here, I have the integrity and the completeness and my data flow and all that stuff. I can click on integrity. It will give you a total list of problems, orphan CIs, so it'll tell you that, oh, this application service is orphaned. It doesn't have the parent and child relationships that it expects it to have. And then you also have duplicates. And going through these duplicates, you can try to see what is and isn't reasonable. To be fair, this is an aggressive qualification. But I did find a particular CI, this one right here, and you'll see, oh, we have 3 records in our data set for this. So let's actually go ahead and click on all those. We'll notice that the serial number is 2A3D31. We'll just key off those first couple of digits here. This is a VMware, so it's a virtual system. We can scroll down through here and we see, oh, the attribute data source list, it does come from ADDM, but there are several things that come from Asset Sandbox. So Discovery has updated this at some point, but also a user has updated this at some point. So we can go through this and kind of see what's going on. Let's look at this next one. So let's look at this one. 2A3D as well. That's good. And we have all this other information. If we scroll down to our attribute, okay, this doesn't have any information in the attribute data source list. So we'd have to maybe investigate a little bit further on where this came from. We could look at the create dates and modified dates. That is very important in a lot of cases. In this case, because I know what happened, I know that these were all made within about 15 minutes of each other for this demonstration. But we can see that this all lines up. One thing to take a look at for this, host name is null. If we go back and look at the other one, host name is in fact populated. Also notice that there's a typo here. For those of you that have paid attention to asset management or CMDB in the past, usually host name is not the fully qualified name. It is instead the host name minus the domain, and domain is on its own field. Now we can scroll up here and let's take a look at this third option, and we'll notice that its host name is correct. The domain is correct, so this looks good, but the serial number is not the same. It is not that same 2A3D. Instead, it is 4205. And you'll see the token ID, which is an automatically generated ID from Discovery, also matches this. And we can see that all of this information comes from Discovery. None of it comes from the Asset Sandbox, so no user entered this information. This really provides us a real conundrum that we're going to have to go through. First, do you trust your data sources? How much do you trust Discovery? How much do you trust the users entering your data? Some organizations might trust Discovery more. Some might trust their users more. This could be particularly important in an environment where they have air-gapped data centers. They will stand up a Discovery instance once a month, once every 3 months, however often, scan this air-gapped data center, and then export those records physically on a USB pen or external drive of some kind. So maybe with that data set, by the way, I would suggest a separate data set for that import. Maybe that particular data set, we don't trust it as much as users, but maybe this data set is a daily scan of a data center where I know that Discovery is checking it and I trust it. I know it works for everything else. So I have to really look at this. So let's actually do what we did before. Let's go back to edit mode and let's edit this instance. So I have a result from the ADDM data set. I have a result from the production data set, a sandbox data set, another from production, another from production, and then another from my sandbox. Okay, so these are all use cases here. My 3 production data sets, none of them are from my personal sandbox. I've already validated that. I do have one here from the asset sandbox, so it tells me it came from the asset management interface. So that's definitely something I could look into. But what's really happened here, and I know this because once again I've kind of created this scenario, upon further investigation, You'll notice that the serial number is in reverse. You'll notice that this also has the category type items wrong. All this is someone has entered this data incorrectly. And because there was a reconciliation ID already, it made sure to merge that appropriately. And then after a discovery resync, discovery noticed, oh, this asset no longer matches what it should. And it actually created a whole new record because it just could not relate that bad data backwards. This really brings me to kind of how do we proactively solve this? This is going to be a pretty simple solution. First, I would actually delete my sandbox records. Once again, we do not delete these records with the delete. Instead, mark this for deletion. I also only really want the records that actually contain real data from discovery. I don't want data that's been fat-fingered by an individual. So I'm going to mark it for deletion. My sandbox data, it could all stay. This one would also want to be marked as deleted. As a rule of thumb, you want to keep the oldest record. That's going to have all of your audit data, your oldest relationship data, and you're going to want to make sure that your data source, ADDM, or my sandbox or whatever, actually matches what's expected in these other areas because they have two different reconciliation identities. I may want to come into my source data set, set my reconciliation identity to 0 if it's already there. That way it'll force it to be re-identified. I would probably want to make sure that my host name is properly configured. So these are things you'll have to make sure that the data is right. But then you need to take a step back and retrospect on this. Are my data sources accurate? If in this scenario, discovery was causing bad data to get into my CMDB, I need to get a TKU update or something like that that will discover this asset correctly. A second option, which is something that in this exact scenario where an end user has tried to modify this and for good or for worse, entered data incorrectly, causing identification rules not to line up. If all of that was to happen, maybe the solution is let's introduce some workflow into asset management that says your end user host name has already been defined. This is a discovered CI. The last scan date is relatively recently. You can't change this field. This would be a customization on your part, but it is a customization that could prevent hours of troubleshooting for bad data entry. Ultimately, you want as little manual entry as possible because manual entry tends to be bad. I mean, even if you have a user that is 90% entering data accurately, which I would say that's even a good number for a user, usually it's slower, it's more costly. There's still 10% that's wrong. There's a lot of problems with that, and you want to avoid it as much as possible, but you can't avoid it completely. So adding just a few fail-safes in front of that can save you a lot of valuable time in the end. There's definitely ways to use the CMDB portal to your advantage, marking them for deletion instead of physically deleting them. You will have to do some investigation with each individual CI and make sure that they are or aren't true duplicates, where that came from, and then reconcile that difference after the fact to make sure that isn't a repeatable scenario. So after we've went through this marked as deletion for our duplicates scenario, a lot of you might be wondering, how do I get rid of them? Because they're still there. They're only soft deleted. And that's totally true. This also kind of starts our conversation into how do I manage old data that I want to get rid of? And maybe your company has a data retention policy of some kind where you need to keep your data for so many years. You're also concerned about the old data junking up your system, being a problem with change management and some other applications. And that's very important as well. But a CMDB ultimately is supposed to be a reflection of your IT environment at any moment in time, not in the past. So that's something that's very important to keep in mind, and we actually have tools to kind of help manage that. We're going to go over that now. So the first thing is I'm going to go ahead and look at my reconciliation jobs, and you'll notice that I changed my activity type to purge. Usually it starts with the identify, So it'll only show you recon jobs that have an identify phase to them. Well, we're actually going to create one for purge. You'll notice there is one pending. I have this demo.purge job that I created. You'll notice it has two steps, a copy and a purge. Purge will delete the data that is marked for deletion. If we take a step back, we'll go to our recon jobs again. And the out-of-the-box ADDM job actually has a ID, a merge, and a purge action to it. This purge action is only deleting data in the ADDM dataset. If we take a look at it real quick, that it also has a verify soft delete in target dataset. So it will not actually purge the record until the production dataset, bmc.asset, has also been marked for deletion. That way you don't end up actually deleting something before that change has been propagated accordingly. We can talk about that at a later point too. But we're going to go ahead and cancel this because we don't want to change it. But we went ahead and created a purge activity for the golden data set, the bmc.asset. There is no verify the soft delete because there is no target data set beyond this. But we also want to make sure that we're cleaning up our production data set, not allowing old data to sit there forever and ever. But a step that I'm taking beyond that is this demo copy. This will help address some concerns by other people where I want to let all my stuff stay here forever, but I also have some data retention requirements, and I'm just not ready to delete this data yet. So I'm going to go ahead and edit the job. We're going to look at this copy, and what it does is there's a qualifier here that you can select. And if I uncheck this qualification, and I'll have to select a rule set. I created a rule set earlier that just says, if it's marked for deletion, then it meets the qualification. Now that that rule set is created, if it meets that, it's going to push that data into the bmc.sample data set, getting it out of my production. And of course, this is a sequence 200. And then sequence 700 will go ahead and purge the data afterwards. So that's a very important use case. I'm going to go ahead and save my changes. And you'll notice that this job also, if I go back into it, has a weekly schedule, just once on Saturday. You obviously could run this more or less frequent as needed. I'm going to go ahead and start the job. And this job will start executing. And it is currently in progress. It's evaluating a ton of records, it seems like. Take a little bit for it to complete. All right, there we go. After it's done, it found 3 records and it deleted them. Guess what? Those are the 3 records that we chose to delete earlier. And that's fine. That's good. That's exactly what we expect to see. And having some kind of a process like this to help clean up your data and move it around will also be helpful. I'm not going to go into it today, but you can also go to configurations. You can go to your archive manager, and you can start creating archive policies for different classes. You can see that I have a check mark here, and based upon the create date being less than or equal to this date, then it's going to go ahead and archive it to this form. You are able to use this to kind of manage your archive processes. Because of the nature of CMDB, I'm not as big of a fan of this because you have this marked as delete attribute that sometimes can really play a role in this. I would much rather control it at the copy and marked as delete purge level than here. Once again, not going to get into it too in depth, but did want to let everyone know that this is an available option for managing that long-term data. All right, so now that we've talked about how to kind of retire the data, I'm going to actually use that as a springboard into our next topic, maximizing data sets. Now, I'm not going to bore you with creating a bunch of data sets and creating jobs. That's something most people are comfortable to go ahead and do. And if you have any questions or concerns with creating data sets and recon jobs and things like that, feel free to open up a support ticket, talk with your account manager and other people involved. But first, let's go ahead and get into this, maximizing data sets, and kind of get a hierarchical view of this. This is a generalized overview of how data sets might look for a organization, where you have on the left-hand side discovery, asset sandbox, our asset management system, and you have footprints, which is BMC client management. All of those are getting reconciled into the production data set, bmc.asset, And once again, we have that purge job, but we also have that copy where we are copying stuff out into this retire 2022, 2021, 2020. I would recommend sectioning those up so that way at year's end, you can lock that data set, and then you can proceed to keep that until you just don't need it anymore, and everyone just universally agrees that we don't need the data set from 1999 or whatever, right? No one needs anything from 25 years ago, hopefully. So these are just examples quickly of how you can do your data retention practice, and this keeps the data out of your live data set, so it impacts performance a lot less, and it proceeds to allow this data flow to happen at a rapid rate, which really matches what we're seeing in our current environments. Another example is data imports, and this is something similar. This is a very similar graphic to what we were seeing just a second ago, except for we have two different sources of data coming in, and I intentionally put one on the left and one on the right. You have our left-hand side, once again, Discovery, Asset Sandbox, and Footprints, which are regular data sources. They're scanned data sources. They're things that are being updated all the time. They might be continuous jobs in some instances. They might be rapid schedules, what I would call them, where you're doing them multiple times per day on a schedule, or at least daily. But on the right-hand side, rather, we have these organization import jobs. And this, I gave an example earlier in our demonstration where a customer was doing regular spreadsheet imports. They would do this, once every year. And maybe this is the data set type that you're looking at. And what makes this uniquely important is because each one of these would require their own job, their own reconciliation, normalization jobs. And on top of that, they're going to have different data entered in them each year versus ADDM and versus Footprints. And of course, Discovery and client management and even asset management in some instances, those are going to have many different types, unique identifiers. We looked at one earlier, like host name. We looked at serial number, and there's all kinds of other things. Unique identifier from Discovery. There's certainly other ways that we could identify a duplicate CI, tag numbers, etc. But these spreadsheet imports, they're not always perfect because you're getting them from data sources that aren't always reliable. They're not always trained well. They're not always groomed perfectly. So maybe in 2020, you had a new company that you acquired, and that particular job just wasn't as proficient as you normally would expect. And after some training in 2021 and 2022, that got a lot better. And so this will allow you to create a unique identification job, a unique merge, purge, copy, and all kinds of abilities to help groom that data before it gets into your production data set. So, like I said, 2020 might be completely different than 2021, and that might be different than 2022. And this also helps kind of keep you a historical record for what was imported into your system, so you can always reference back at a later point in time. Very important to keep this. And then, of course, once your import period is done, you can always lock that data set down, remove those old jobs because you don't need them anymore. It's already in or it's not. And then move on to next year's import at the next point in time. All right, so the last thing that we have to go over here, and I'm going to come back to this console. I've talked about it a couple of times, locking your data set. Now, this isn't exactly something that you're going to do all the time. It's not particularly, I'm not going to say it's not recommended, but it's something to take with caution, understand what you're doing. We'll go to our CMDB portal. We're going to go to the data sources. We're going to manage data sources. And you'll see where you have data sources, statistics, and then data sets. I'm going to click on my 15 total data sets. And let's say I want to lock my demo sample CI data set. I don't want that to be written to anymore. You can see where it says accessibility is writable. I'm going to go ahead and edit the data set. And you'll notice that it's not editable from here. Once again, this is something that do it with caution. So you actually are going to have to open up mid-tier to do that. All right, so once you log into your mid-tier, we're going to go ahead and we're going to go to the object list really quick. And the form that we're looking for is named bmc.core.config bmc dataset. And we're going to find the data set that we want. And we'll notice here that my demo sample CI data set is writable. I'm going to go ahead and change this to read only and click save. And now this data set can no longer have any changes made to it. It's locked. Now I can always change it back to writable and save it. But I'm going to leave this as read-only for now because this demo is done. All the data that I've put in my sample data set is completed. I'm never going to use it again. And I want this to be a historical record of the presentation that we've done here today. This is another example of how to manipulate your data sets to kind of get everything you can out of them. So that way you can have that fine, granular control of your data.